Welcome back, everyone. I am honored to welcome our next guest, author, environmentalist, and activist, Bill McKibben. Hi, Bill. Thanks for being with us today.
It's very good to be with you. How are you?
I'm doing great now that you're here. There's so much I want to ask you. Let's get straight into it. I know that you've talked about why the critical time for action on climate change has passed, yet you still remain hopeful, which is very encouraging. Specifically, you've mentioned social movements as a source of optimism. I just want to explore a little bit more how social movements are moving the needle, so to speak, in your opinion.
Well, look, uh, the best time to have acted on climate change is always going to have been yesterday. And I've been saying that for 30 years since I wrote the first book about this. But for a long time, we didn't act because I think we assumed that our leaders simply would, that the science would finally break through. It took quite a while for people to understand that we had won the argument about the reality of climate change, but we were losing the fight because the fight wasn't about data or reason or evidence. It was about money and power. And the fossil fuel industry had so much that they were able to go on winning. That's when people began to organize in movements. It's when we starting things like 350.org. And these have been growing slowly for a decade. And then the last couple of years, growing explosively. We've seen the wonderful power of things like the Sunrise Movement with the Green New Deal, Extinction Rebellion, maybe most beautifully, the high school students following Greta Thunberg's lead into these climate strikes all over the world. And the thing to realize, that I've come to know over the last year, is that there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs all over the planet, young people of extraordinary ability and commitment, and they're just great. And so there's a bigger movement now than there's been in the past, but it's not okay to take the biggest problem the world ever faced and just offload it onto the shoulders of 14-year-olds to solve. I mean, time for everybody to join in this fight, and the movements continue to grow, especially in this fight to try and hold banks and asset managers and insurance companies responsible for the havoc that they're causing by funding the fossil fuel industry.
I think you hit the nail right on the head that you've got a bunch of young people, none of which are technically responsible for the climate crisis, and yet they have taken upon themselves to do something because it's now up to them to create a future that they want to live in. And I agree. I can't find that even more inspiring. And it's very much in the ethos of Earth Day and the first Earth Day set 50 years ago. So I feel like we're seeing a lot of that energy, that power, that fire in younger people, and it's incredibly inspiring. The other thing that I think is really interesting that you've spoken about is that not all technology may be useful on the road to sustainability. So, what's an example of tech that you see advancing conservation solutions?
Well, I mean, we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the engineers who have done spectacular work over the last decade, really, in bringing down the price of solar panels and wind turbines to the point where they're the cheapest way to generate power on this planet. We've watched the price drop 90%. That should change everything. I mean, we can now, if we wanted to, make a rapid conversion to the use of renewable energy to power a great deal of our lives. And there are a few countries that have done it. Uh, Great scholars like Mark Jacobs have pointed out in extreme detail how we could do it in every corner of the earth, come up with plans for every state and every country. Really, all that stands in the way at this point is the incredible political power of the fossil fuel industry, which has been able, even now, to thwart real action, to suck up billions of dollars in subsidies, um, um, to keep our political system from really responding. But thank heaven the engineers have done the job that they have. Of course, the other part of this is we use more energy than we need to. And that conservation is also part of what we need to do. And though there are no silver linings to a pandemic, there are some things one can learn from them. And one of them is that we're capable of having conversations like the ones that you and I are having right now that don't require much in the way of carbon at all. In fact, I don't know about you, but my computer's powered off the very sunny day that's falling on our shingles here in Vermont right now.
That's fantastic. It's fabulous to hear you say that, especially since, Bill, looking back at the first book or the book that you wrote about 30 years ago now, The End of Nature, pivotal book. Um, your intention seemed to be to warn people about the consequences of inaction regarding the climate crisis. And I want to kind of herald back to what you said in the first question. How different is that message from the message you've adopted in your latest book, Falter?
Well, 30 years ago, since it was the first book about all of this stuff, I was in essence providing warnings about what would happen if we didn't do anything. And then we didn't really do anything. And so now, sadly, myself and now a huge number of other climate journalists are providing kind of reports from the front line, watching the effects of this climate change play out around the world. I mean, in the horror of this pandemic, we've almost forgotten by now that 2020 began with the greatest firestorm the world may ever have seen in the forests of Australia. A couple of billion animals killed in the course of a few weeks. But that catastrophe continues even as this crisis unfolds. So the the message now is we can't stop global warming. It's too late for that. We can perhaps stop it short of the point where it overwhelms our civilizations, but that's going to require us going to work right now and going to work really hard and really fast. Among other things, it's going to require coming out of this pandemic and the economic shambles that it's creating with a plan for recovery that prioritizes trying to prevent the next catastrophe, climate change, as it looms up. And that's happily precisely what some countries on Earth are doing. I'm very pleased to see.
Well, it looks like we may have lost Bill's audio, but to conclude, Bill is one of the uh, forefront people in this movement. He's one of the big proponents of you need more than hope, you need courage, and you need action to move forward with a climate plan. And Bill has been that voice for 30 years. So we're sorry that we missed him, and we're sorry that the connection may have been a little bit bad there. But hey, live TV, and oh, great! And it sounds like we have Bill back. Okay. Oh, he just poor Bill. He just hung out. Well, I have some concluding thoughts that I think he would have told us all. He is a big proponent of saying what the next 30 years would look like. He ultimately believes that we will start using solar, we will start using wind, we will start using a lot of renewable energies. And so I think that is, he's realistic about the situation, but he also understands the industry, and he's a big proponent of optimism. And that's all we can ask for is a bright future starting now, working towards it now. So with that, if Bill were here, I would have said thank you so much for joining us today. We loved having you. And on to the next segment.